Welcome to Luxor, where we continue our story of ancient Egypt. In our last program, we showed you the mighty monuments of the Pyramid Age. So let's just first refresh our memory as to how it all ended. Firstly, there was the destruction of Egypt's farms and flocks by the 10 devastating plagues. Then the annihilation of the Egyptian army in the waters of the Red Sea in the Exodus. And finally, the collapse of power of the 12th dynasty. Egypt was then occupied by the mysterious Hyksos, who were later driven out of Egypt, and the kings of the 18th dynasty ushered in a glorious era of prosperity and power.
Well, it was probably Seqenen-Re of the 17th dynasty who started the War of Liberation against the Hyksos. And how it all started is really rather ludicrous, you wouldn't believe it. A delegation came from the Hyksos king way down there in the delta, some 700 kilometres away, and this delegation came up here to Luxor and said, look, you are digging a canal, and there are hippopotami in this canal, and their grunting at night is keeping the Hyksos king awake. Well, Seqenen-Re had to do something about it, and so he politely said, all right, I'll do something. But after they went, I can just see him turning to his courtiers and saying, listen, you fellas, I've had it. That's the last straw. I'm going to drive these fellas out of the land of Egypt. And so the War of Liberation started. Well, Seqenen-Re was not successful. In fact, if you look at his mummy in the Cairo Museum, you find that it has 2 savage gashes in the forehead, and archaeologists have fitted a battle axe blade in there, and they find that it just fits perfectly. Apparently he died of a battle axe wound in this War of Liberation. But he was succeeded by his son, Kamoses, and by his brother, Ahmosis, and between them they successfully drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and off the pages of history. Well, they were followed by Amenophis I, and then Thutmose I. Well, Thutmose I started something new. You see, up until this time, all the previous kings had been buried in pyramids. But apparently Thutmose I decided there was no future in that. They were being robbed and plundered anyway. And so he started a new idea. It's way over there on the other side of the River Nile. And it's called the Valley of the Kings, where this idea started. Oh, this is just beautiful. I love this scenery. I'm walking along 6 o'clock in the morning along the bank of the Nile here at Luxor. The reeds are floating down the river. Over there, see those hills? Well, over there is the Valley of the Kings. And that's where Thutmose I started this new burial fashion. We're going to go over in a ferry and finish up in the Valley of the Kings right over there. Here we are looking down on the Valley of the Kings. And instead of building a pyramid for his burial place, Thutmose had his workmen chisel a hole into the side of the valley, and there at the end of the passage he had a tomb chamber. Now, he was followed by other kings who did the same thing, and some of these tomb passages go 100 meters into the side of the cliff, and there are some beautiful paintings on the walls. At the end of the passage was a tomb chamber in which was a sarcophagus in which the king's mummy was buried. Well, Tutmosis I was responsible for this obelisk that you see behind me here, and it stands over 21 metres high. And if we are to accept the revised chronology of Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky, it's rather interesting to notice that Tutmosis I would be contemporary with King Solomon of Israel. All right, if that is the case, then this passage we find here in 1 Kings 3:1 is applicable. It says, "Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter." And so Solomon would have been the son-in-law of Tutmosis I. Now, this Pharaoh gave his daughter a very unusual dowry for her wedding. You'll never guess what it was. But I'm going to read to you from 1 Kings chapter 9 and in verse 16 where it says, "Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer and burned it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife." Well now, if what I'm saying is correct, we should be able to find some evidence of Gezer being burned with fire. Let us have a look at the city of Gezer and the excavations there. It was built on this hill, and over the other side, the archaeologists have done some excavating. They have carved a deep trench which exposes the strata or layers of occupation. I went there and had a good look at these strata, and I found that there was a layer of ash there. Very heavy ash, in fact. I brought back some of the grains of wheat that had been burnt and carbonised. You can still distinctly see the little grains of wheat. So Gezer was thoroughly burned. All right, then who did it? I took some pottery from underneath this burnt stratum, and I showed it to one of Israel's top archaeologists for identification. He, without hesitation, said, "This comes from the early Bronze period." Now, that means, in my thinking, that this was the Canaanite occupation, and above it was the Middle Bronze, which I consider to be the Israelite occupation. So here we have the evidence at Gezer that the Canaanites were conquered at some time, their city was burned, and above it is the evidence of Israelite occupation. When Tutmosis I died, he was succeeded by his son, Tutmosis II. But this poor guy didn't last very long, only for another 4 years, and then he seems to have dropped dead. Well, he had no successor except his son by another wife, who was Tutmosis III. But he was only a boy, he was only a child at the time. And so the wife of Tutmosis II assumed the throne. Her name was Queen Hatshepsut, whose statue you see here. And Hatshepsut reigned for 21 peaceful and prosperous years. Well, she seems to have liked the job because she started off as a regent, but then this statue depicts her with a queen's attire, female attire. Now, this statue here depicts her as having male attire. Do you see that? In other words, she was assuming the role not of a queen now, but of a king, a pharaoh. And she took all the titles of a pharaoh. And her statues in the Cairo Museum actually depict her as wearing a beard. For instance, this statue and then this sphinx of her shows her with a beard. Now you might say that's ridiculous, a woman wearing a beard. But you see, the pharaohs themselves were clean shaven, and they simply stuck a beard on their chins for ceremonial occasion, and I suppose Hatshepsut figured if the men can do it, she can do it too. Anyway, that's what she did. Well, Hatshepsut built some tremendous obelisks. This one lying here is the biggest one in the land of Egypt at the present time. It's snapped in half, actually. And this other one that is standing over here is the largest standing obelisk in the land of Egypt, in contrast to her father's, Tutmosis, over there. Her obelisk is more than 30 metres high. She was also responsible for a magnificent mortuary temple. Well, Western people today are buried in holes in the ground like that, and then they put a tombstone on top. Well, this is Hatshepsut's tombstone. Only call it a beautiful mortuary temple. And I consider that she should be identified with the Queen of Sheba. You see, it says in 1 Kings chapter 10 and in verse 1, "Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions." Well, who was this Queen of Sheba? I don't think we should be in any doubt myself, because Jesus Christ identifies her. In Matthew 12 and in verse 42, he says, "Now when the Queen of the South came to hear the wisdom of Solomon," she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. He calls her the Queen of the South. Well, in Daniel chapter 11, we have the King of the North and the King of the South. And there, the King of the South is identified as the King of Egypt. And so if the King of the South is the King of Egypt, well then surely the Queen of the South must be the Queen of Egypt. And that is what Josephus, the ancient historian, says. He identifies her as the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. Here is Hatshepsut's mother, and she's seated on the birth stool, and the baby will be placed here. And she depicts herself as being born in the presence of the gods. Here is the god Tot, here is the god Amun, and here was the baby being received by the gods. This was to establish her claim to the throne. This scene shows Hatshepsut's expedition to the land of Punt. You can see her soldiers with their shields standing on the deck of the ship, see the fish underneath, and they're going on this expedition to God's land. Here are her sailors pulling on the oars. You see the ship there and the mast. They're on the way to the land of Punt. Now up here are some trees and plants that this expedition brought back from the land of Punt. The archaeologists didn't know where the land of Punt was, and so they called on the botanists and said, "Listen, you fellows, can you tell us where these plants come from?" And the botanist said, "Sure, we can tell you. They come from East Africa, maybe Somalia or Eritrea." And so the archaeologists said, "Fine, now we know where the land of Punt is." But I think there's another explanation. Look at it this way. In 1 Kings chapter 10, and in verse 10 it says, "Then she," that is the Queen of Sheba, "gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in precious great abundance, precious stones, also the ships, and King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired. Also the ships of Hiram brought gold from Ophir, and great quantities of almug wood or trees, and precious stones from Ophir." Now you see, they actually brought these things from East Africa, and when the Queen of Sheba came there, she said, "Yeah, I want some of them." And so they brought them back, and I think that's why they finished up on this wall. There was something else that impressed the Queen of Sheba in her visit to Solomon. It says, "And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built," that's his temple, "and his entryway or his ascent by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her." You see, there was something about the way he went up to the temple that impressed her. And when you look at this, it seems to me that she came back and said to her workmen, "Now look, I want a temple built like that." This is unique, you see. There was never anything like this before in the land of Egypt. Now, it is true that most archaeologists identify Sheba with a city in southwest Arabia by the name of Marib. But for this, there is no inscriptional evidence to support it. Wendell Phillips, an American archaeologist, conducted an excavation there, very exciting really, and he wrote a book called Sheba's Buried City. Wonderful book. But there's no evidence to support this view that the Queen of Sheba came from southwest Arabia. But suddenly, Queen Hatshepsut disappears from the scene. And we suspect that her son-in-law, Thutmose III, whose relief is seen here, knew something about it. Because immediately we find him going round the land of Egypt, demolishing her statues and erasing her name from her inscriptions. Here was a relief of Hatshepsut, seated upon her throne with her scepter in her hand. And Thutmose sent his workmen round here, and see how they've chiselled it all off. This was part of his rage to show his anger at being held back from the throne so long. So he became the mightiest of all the pharaohs. He conducted no less than 17 military campaigns, very successful. and he left some very fine statues of himself. For instance, there is this statue in the Luxor Museum and this very fine statue in the New York Museum. Tutmosis was also responsible for this great festal hall here at Karnak, in which the archaeologists found a very important king list. He was also responsible for erecting 4 big obelisks. He depicts 2 of them on his wall over there. One of them has since gone to the city of London and stands on the Thames embankment. Another has gone to New York. Another one has gone to Istanbul, and the biggest of them all stands in front of the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. It's 32.2 metres high and weighs 455 tonnes. It's an enormous thing, the biggest obelisk that was ever made in the land of Egypt. Tutmosis III, whose relief you see here, left this record of his military campaigns. And he records here over 100 cities, each one depicted by this oval with the form on top, cities which he conquered in Palestine and Syria. At the top of this list, there is the city of Kadesh. Now, the word Kadesh means holy or holy city, and this could refer to Jerusalem. Now, if what we're saying is correct, this then is a record of the Bible story of Rehoboam being invaded by the Pharaoh of Egypt. And it says here in 1 Kings 14 and verse 25, "Now it happened in the 5th year of the king Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything away. He also took away the gold shields which Solomon had made." Now, Tutmosis not only left a record of the cities he conquered, but he left a record of the loot that he took. And I want to show you that.